So if science is only expressed in a language that a learner doesn't identify with, it's very difficult to identify with the subject matter.
Number two, the use of mother tongue-based bilingual education in our sector is absolutely the right way to go. And saying and promoting mother tongue languages and South African languages is how we are going to help improve our literacy and numeracy crisis rate.
Because a staggering 70% of South African learners in grade 1 to 3 are unable to recognize letters or read words quickly enough to understand them. That's according to the first of its kind Funda Uphumelele national survey launched by the Department of Basic Education. Only about 3 in 10 young children are reaching the reading milestone they need to stay on track. At the launch in Pretoria yesterday, Minister Siviwe Kwagube said the findings demand urgent action to avoid a future generation locked out of opportunities. Kwagube joins us now for more. Minister, good to chat to you again. Always good to have you on the show, although this time it's not in studio. What is that urgent action? Because clearly it is demanded and needed at this time. Good morning.
Good morning, Arabile, and good morning to your viewers. I think perhaps we need to take a step back. You will recall, Arabile, a couple of years ago, there was an international benchmarking test that was taken that showed us that 8 out of 10 children in South Africa can't read for meaning in any language by the time they get to grade 4. And so we know what the problem is, and part of the reason why we did the Funda Siphumelele survey was that we wanted to understand why is it that our children are struggling. Is it that the diverse languages in our country is the hindrance to their literacy abilities? And this study for me, while yes, of course, it confirms some of the crisis that we face in South Africa, that which we've known, but for the first time, it's actually pointing us to a solution. It's saying that African languages, and South African languages in particular, are not a hindrance to literacy in South Africa. In fact, they're an asset and a tool. So one of the things that was found by the survey was that children who are taught in their mother tongue from the time that they're in ECD to in the foundation phase perform far better than children who are not. And so one of the things that we saw, and which was a staggering result, was a place, for instance, like Limpopo, where in a particular area or district where children were learning in Chivenda, those children were performing much better than, for instance, an area in Gauteng where there was mixed language use. The point I'm making with this is that for the first time we have a South African grown solution to what we need to do with our literacy crisis. What this survey has also proven to us is that actually, if and the majority of your learners are not English and Afrikaans speaking, then you should be able to be putting a lot more status on their home languages, and that we should be making sure that our teachers are able to teach in home languages. Of course, in places like Gauteng, for instance, where there's a greater language mix in many communities, you're not going to find an isiZulu area or a Sesotho area, and you can see that in the data actually when it comes to some of the findings. But when we found that a lot of children, particularly in rural areas where there was one specific language being spoken, they were performing quite well. So the point I'm making with this is that it confirms two things for us. Number one, the focus on foundation learning and the foundations of learning is absolutely the right one, because that's actually where the original sin happens. That's where children are failed in the very first couple of years of being at school.
Language is that which I identify myself with. When I grow up, as I'm born, I'm growing up, you're feeding me your language. This is what I know. This is my being. Is represented after this language is this own person or in a kai. But look at the evil that happens to an African person. Is that when you reach a certain age, when you're about to go to school, you realize that what you thought that you are. You remember that when you are growing up, you were raised by your parents. You think your parents are God. You know why you think your parents are God? You think your parents are God because they can do anything. Your world is limited. Your everything is, I'm hungry, I want to do this, so they can do everything. And that also informs you. That's why our kids become noisy. They do everything. They jump on my sofa. They do those things. They're like, Umntwana lona. No, Umntwana is actually extrapolating what you are giving him. You are telling them you can do anything. That's why you're like, my mama can do anything. My father can do anything. You see? So the child is extrapolating. I can do anything. So I can jump over the sofa. I can do this. I can do this. And she says, no, don't do that. Don't do that. And it's like, wow, really? I can't do it, but you can do it. I mean, and then she goes to school. And then she gets to realize that, oh, of our own is not good enough. I need to be unplugged. My mother is not good enough. My ancestors are not good enough. Damn, I'm not good enough. Is it? So now already we have introduced a spirit in the child. She'll grow up, she'll have to struggle. The best of us, of course, will come up their lives with flying colors, but there is a struggle in the child that she will never get rid of. That you as a parent, you've put your child there in. And that's why now the default state of an African person is to be rebellion towards their parents.
Number two, the use of mother tongue-based bilingual education in our sector is absolutely the right way to go. And saying and promoting mother tongue languages and South African languages is how we are going to help improve our literacy and numeracy crisis rate. It's what I was saying yesterday is gone are the days where we are lamenting the statistic. For me, Arabile, I need to come back to you in a year or two and say we've halved the number of children who can't read for meaning. Yeah. And that children are increasingly being able to do this and meet their key mark. It just requires a different type of thinking. It requires a different type of reliance on our languages. As opposed to treating them as a hindrance, we are treating them as actually a tool to get children to read and to read better. But if we really elevate our languages.
So if most learners must learn mathematics and science in their second or third language, surely the teachers have a similar challenge of having to teach something that's fairly abstract, can be very difficult to teach in their second or third language. So this really, for me, is like is a very profound challenge that goes both ways. But there's also issues with science. So let me look at some issues with science, right? Science has a very strong colonial past. Modern science, the current scientific edifice was built on, amongst other things, an inhumane appropriation of indigenous knowledge. I'll give you an example of that. For example, when European colonizers discovered the source, for example, of a spice or of a natural plant that would become very big in Europe and have a lot market and lots of uses in Europe, what they would do is they would send armed people to come and enslave and really like kill a lot of people who knew where this plant came from, the people who knew the roots of the plants, what its meaning, its uses, and so on. And then they would enslave them and they would control the production, but their slaves who had all the indigenous knowledge would have to apply that knowledge for the Europeans to get the plants and put them and bring them to the European market. And so it's really an inhumane appropriation of indigenous knowledge. I don't know how else to describe it. Modern science has a lot of baggage like that. So that's an issue with science. Another issue with science is that in South Africa, the transformation of the scientific community is slow, right? So we are looking, at 20 plus years of democracy now. And while in the past, a low number of candidates for scientific positions or scientific studies of non-white groups may have been a problem, it's not the case anymore. The square kilometer issues with maths and science teaching. We've touched upon that at the beginning, but if we look at the context, from grade 4 onwards, maths and science is taught in English and Afrikaans, right? Below that, it's taught in the mother tongue. But grade 4 is age 8, turning on 9. These are really, really young kids. And from there on, from that age, you have to learn maths and science in a language that may not be your first. So this represents a very unfair disadvantage for the vast majority of Black kids in South Africa. It's really, so the census data, again, it's those numbers. It's really quite quite a big barrier. As been mentioned earlier, South Africa is amongst the worst in the world at teaching maths and science. It sounds very harsh, but sadly, it is shown over and over. So South Africa performs really poorly in international benchmarking programs like TIMSS. Now, if we look at sort of official documents that say, oh, what can we learn from this TIMSS study? How can we approach it? We see a whole range of topics that I've shown here. This is timsessay.org, it's an official publication and so on. And they mention a lot of things. They even go and look at whether the schools are fee status, fee paying and no fee paying schools and so on. But there's no mention of language. And so in this picture, I think, we really need to think, about language in our teaching of maths and science, in a way of building up the maths and science community in South Africa, that we are aware not just of the richness of the indigenous language, but also of the limitations of the English language. Another thing is the key role of indigenous knowledge. A lot of indigenous knowledge about the natural world is there in language, embedded in language, in lore, and similarly, in the origin of words. Like I just explained the origin of word astronomer in English. Words in all languages have origins and they carry knowledge, right? So the thing is, indigenous knowledge is also often cited as anecdotal or interesting cultural curiosity, but it's often not put, in a place where it belongs in modern science, and it's not used to address modern science. It's changing now, especially in areas that have to do with like plant sciences and things and pharmacology and so on. But in astronomy, that's not really the case. Yet, indigenous language and knowledge is critical to feeling ownership of the subject matter as opposed to the foreignness or herself. So it's really indigenous knowledge and language is key to really infiltrating and making science, which, if we consider science as knowledge that isn't dependent on language, we need to use language to penetrate that knowledge and to be able to teach it. Language is really a thinking framework. It's more than just a set of words. Language shapes our thinking. I've mentioned this earlier before by saying the Western-centric thinking is very classification and nomenclature, and we put things in boxes and so on and so on. But if we speak more languages, it gives us more ways to think, right? So I'll come back to that in a second. And this applies to scientific thinking and understanding and the development of scientific instinct, right? So an indigenous scientific language must build on linguistic instinct. And that's the example that language and knowledge is critical to feeling ownership of the subject matter as opposed to foreignness. Are the consequences of this thought to be at the individual language level or at the cross-language level? I think so the Pleiades and open cluster, I think open cluster as a term has emerged in English, but also in other European languages similarly. So in French, for example, it's amas ouvert, which is literal translation of open cluster. Foreignness refers to the associating English with people that one doesn't identify with. That's what I mean by that. So if science is only expressed in a language that a learner doesn't identify with, it's very difficult to identify with the subject matter.
We asked our audience, we gave them 4 options: better teacher training, more support for parents, focus on mother tongues, and literacy monitoring. 71% are currently saying better teacher training. Do you think that has to be the key in focus here? In 10 seconds.
Leratadi, Liu, if you could ask Dr. Ogman your question, please.
Hi, everyone, and hi, Carolina. Thanks for a nice talk. So I have a question that has 2 parts to it. One about language and translation, and the other part is about, I guess, teaching languages teaching science in native language. And so the first part about translation and linguistic, I guess it's just to say, I mean, we went through some lessons learned from the project. And it looks like a lot of these lessons learned are based on just what is happening in the project, either personal experiences and so forth. What they are not doing is using lessons learned from literature and the scientific community of translators and the scientific community of linguistics. Because basically when you use lessons learned from such literature, you will find that a lot of the lessons learned mentioned here are well documented there and are in fact not new. Things like that you need to translate concept versus words and so forth. So as you appreciate, it's like in astronomy, right? If somebody was just trying to understand what they are learning based on their personal experience, they are not going to make a lot of mileage. So I guess it's just to be aware of that it might be useful to also relate to, to the scientific knowledge in translation and in linguistic. And a lot of that is actually, a lot of it has happened here in South Africa itself. And then my other question is about teaching science in native languages and whether its benefits. And I think it's well documented that multilingualism in education is really good at primary school level. There's a well documented United Nations study about this, and that's why people are pushing that. At the high school and higher levels, it's not so well established that this is the way to go. And I think you sort of hinted at it when you mentioned your background earlier on, in these different countries moving and so forth. So it's not really clear that at that level, indigenous language actually is better, because it's actually concepts that people are having much more a harder time with, concepts of the science or even concepts of practice in that language. So I think it's a bit of a romanticization to just assume, to think that it's the way to go at these higher levels. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Lero, for these comments. Very, very relevant comments indeed. The lessons learned, were really from, yes, indeed from our project. But we got, substantial input. The collaboration is with the Department of African Language Studies at UWC, and their input. So I was sort of telling that from the sort of scientist learning from the linguists' perspective, because I think there's a lack of awareness among scientists who have gone through the motions and are fluent in English now, like myself coming from French or whatever, in how how rich the linguistics actually is and how important it is beyond the scientific concepts. And so yes, they are based on this project, and I really want to communicate that languages is much more complex than just translating single words into a dictionary. That would sort of be the naive approach from a scientist saying, oh, we don't have science in that language, let's just translate those terms. But that it comes with much more baggage, it comes with thinking frameworks, it comes with all of that. And yes, those have been very well studied, absolutely. And you've mentioned the UN mother tongue-based multilingual education. And this is also, I refer to it as a really vast body of knowledge. And when you say that the benefits of multilingual education aren't necessarily clear at high level, I think it is made clear in the context of international education. So for example, international schools in different countries have a very big attraction, and they do multilingual education up till, you know, matric level or equivalent, international baccalaureate and so on, and such programs. So there is evidence of its benefits, but obviously the learners who go to international schools tend to come from very privileged backgrounds and international parents and so on. So the internationalism of their upbringing may also play a role, and it's impossible to assign credit to one or the other, just purely multilingual education or a general international exposure. However, I do think that, you know, well, you mentioned like it's the concept that needs to be translated. When I came to the UK and suddenly everything was in English, I had to stop and pause when I was reading and think, what concept that I know in French does this term relate to? And that sort of increased, if anything, just my reading time by 400% at the beginning, you know? So like it is a cognitive barrier that, you know, that we need to tackle. But I also think when you say that teaching science in mother tongue at high levels is not necessarily well known, I also think that people who are researching education and people who are researching language and instruction may not have focused on science at higher levels very much, because I think science at high level also has a bad reputation of being a difficult subject and something that you can study only if you're a scientist of that subject and so on. So I think there's also sort of a bit of a lack of focus on teaching science at high levels from the education linguistics perspective. But as you mentioned, it's very well studied at primary level. Yes, indeed, absolutely. I hope this helps clarify a bit. And I'd like to finish on this note that if we get this right, just imagine all of us South African learners being fully comfortable in maths and science just for the maths and science and not with language barriers. Just imagine what this could achieve for tomorrow's generation.